Welcome back to the workshop. I'm Bill. Sorry for being out of frame today, but I'm trying to squeeze in two large objects and there isn't much room for me. I've got a Model 9. These were made in the US from about 1924 to 1926. This has some early and late characteristics mixed together, so I'm going to guess it's probably about 1925. This is a Model 2D. And the fiber valve wheel has a letter on it, which is F, which would indicate roughly 1927 for a manufacture date. But the International Coleman Collector's Guide says these were made between 1928 and 1930. So I'm going to guess late 1927 or early 1928. If you don't know much about these early Coleman stoves, they introduced the Model 1 first. It was similar to a Model 2. It had an integrated oven in the lid. And then in 1924 they sort of split the line and they made the Model 9, and this is an original 9, which was just a stove. So it's just got windscreens on it. Both of them have what would later be designated as a towel rack, but these are designed so that they can fold straight back and it just hangs there. And this allows you to fold the lid back and turn it into a work area so it's flat and level with the grate. The Model 9 was just the stove. The Model 2 carried on what they had with the Model 1 and has an integrated oven. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. You may not realize it can be in there. In fact, a lot of people get these and they're stumped because everything folds up into the lid and sometimes things get rusty and stuck. You'll notice the windscreens are kind of odd shaped, and that's why. But the main reason I've got these out here today, you may have seen my video on hot blast stoves, which is a 9D, which is just the stove version of this, identical to this but without the oven. That was a stove that I got that was in rough shape. It had been repainted at least once. It was rusty, so that I kind of had an excuse to start over from scratch. So that went into my electrolysis tank and everything was stripped down, and that was sort of a perfect repaint and restoration to the point where I've never actually taken it camping and really used it beyond just testing it out or using it for show, because you hate to mess something up when it's that beautiful. These I picked up from another collector, and he had already done some work on them. He'd gotten them into more or less working order. There are a few minor issues. He removed all the rusted screws that had to be drilled out and replaced them. And on this Model 9, the tank is all original. You can see he did that to preserve the stenciling on here. It says Coleman 9. But you can imagine if the tank, which is housed inside for storage, is this rough, you can guess how bad the rest of the stove body was. So I don't know what work he put into that, but he repainted it and left it the way it is, and it's a matte black high temperature paint. The Model 2, basically the same thing, although someone has repainted the tank with gloss black. It'd be nice if they all looked like this, but the reason for the matte black paint is because that's pretty much what you get with high temperature paints. I think you can get some in a semi-gloss, you may even get some in a gloss, but once they get hot, they tend to go dull, so usually they are sort of a matte or somewhere in between. So I'm not going to go to all the trouble of doing body work on these and stripping them and repainting them to make them look gorgeous. I want to try to leave them as kind of as they are. I want to put a finish on this tank that will shine it up, make it look better, and preserve the existing paint and the original stenciling. But I also want a finish that I can put on this matte black paint that will be, one, heat resistant, and two, will give it a bit of a gloss. The Model 9, I'm not too worried about heat resistance. I mean, you can paint these with Trimclad or Krylon and they don't get hot enough for it to burn off. But the Model 2 stove, if you've got you know, the burners running to keep it at, say, 400 degrees, which I've done with this. You take an instant or an infrared thermometer and take readings off the top, and it's close to 500 degrees directly over the burners. So what I am going to do is something I've never done before. This is a little bit of an experiment, but I am going to treat these with boiled linseed oil. And from everything I have seen and read, I think this is the solution. Some other collectors I know have done this. I haven't really had a whole lot of answers on the exact procedure. I know this is something that people do on their old cars and trucks, sort of a rat rod thing. If your paint is oxidized and you've got rust, they will use boiled linseed oil to sort of seal it. But out in the weather, it's not going to hold up that well, but I think on a stove it should be fine. What the boiled linseed oil is, it's what's called a drying oil. It's the same idea as what you would use to season a cast iron skillet. And the molecules bind with oxygen from the air around it and form chains or link with each other and become polymerized. So it creates a pretty glossy coating. It should be a fairly hard and durable coating. It is waterproof, although it's not. I think if you had it out in the weather, it would wear off in fairly short order, but for what you do with a stove, I'm not going to leave these out in the rain and snow, so I think it should be a reasonably permanent solution. The only thing I don't know about is how long it will take to dry. Linseed oil, the polymers have to, or the molecules have to polymerize, and that takes time. That's the drying process. And I used boiled linseed oil, which the boiled, as opposed to the regular linseed oil, has already been partially polymerized, so it should dry faster. I've used tung oil, which would actually be my preference. It dries a little bit faster, but I can't find anything on the internet where anybody has actually used tung oil on these, so maybe that's another project for another time. So I'm expecting it will probably take a couple of days for this linseed oil to dry on these, and it may take more than one coat, but we'll see. We'll find out. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove the guts from each of the cases. These are actually really simple. Each burner assembly is held in with 3 screws through the bottom, and it just lifts out. And the tank assemblies are really easy too. They just come out like that. These are, if you ever wonder what the difference is between a 2 and a 9, and of course if they have a 2C and a 9C have the same guts, it's just whether it has an oven or no oven, the 9s have the same guts. But they all are somewhat similar to this. Some of them, they just lift off and pack in there. Some of them, like these, actually rotate back into the back of the case. Or like this. This does not. This just sits back in there. So the first thing I'm going to do again is take the burners out, kind of strip these down, and I will give them a wipe down with some mineral spirits just to make sure everything's clean. They're a little bit dusty, to get any crud out of there. And then I'll meet you back here and we'll start applying our boiled linseed oil. Safety first. This is not particularly volatile stuff to work with. However, you need to dispose of your rags properly. The chemical reaction that causes polymerization produces heat. So don't wad your rags up and throw them in the garbage. Don't wad them up and leave them anywhere, because that heat can build up and is notorious for causing fires, especially if you've got some nice cotton kindling for it to start burning. So ideally have an airtight metal container you can put them in, preferably with water in it. You might try rinsing them out, maybe with some dish soap or something, to try to get a little bit of the linseed oil out. Don't put them out in the sun. That's just going to add heat, and it could combust. My suggestion is to keep them in a shady place. I do it in the garage, and I just drape them over the rungs on a ladder and let them dry out. Once they're dried, take a few days, but once they're dried, then they're safe to throw away. Just make sure they're dried before you do that. So I said I've never used this on painted metal. I've used it on wood, and as the instructions say, it should dry and you can recoat within roughly 48 hours. I don't know if it will dry as quickly on metal, but the main thing we want here, I got more of that than I wanted, but the main thing here is use some kind of like a cotton rag and put it on lightly. So just see, rub it in, especially since some of these surfaces are a little bit, well, they were rusty at one point. I think someone has treated them, but you don't want to put this on with a brush or whether that's a bristle brush or a foam roller. Don't do that because you're going to put it on too thick. You basically want to put on almost like a residue. So this is the same idea with seasoning a cast iron skillet. You put oil on there. When I do that, I use flaxseed oil, which is like the food grade equivalent of linseed oil. I think they may actually come from the same deal. I have heard people talk about doing something similar with stoves, lanterns, what have you, using all sorts of oils. I was talking with someone about this today, and they said, oh, use mineral oil. I've commonly seen people talk about using WD-40. When I was trying to find information on this online, one of the things I ran across was a video about shady used car dealers putting transmission fluid on old oxidized paint to bring shine back to it. So this is not a new trick. But I don't know why you would use mineral oil or WD-40 or something that isn't going to polymerize, because if it doesn't polymerize, you're just going to make it all oily. So you can see how that gives it a gloss, and it should keep most of that gloss. I think that actually brought out the stencil a bit. Most of the sea is gone, but the rest of it is largely there. And it shines up the paint quite a bit. So that's exactly what I was going for, and it should protect it too. So I'm going to set this aside now. All right, let's get to work on this number 2 now. So as far as the lid goes, or the oven, I'll show you how this works. You open it up. And this is the stand. Just move that back there for a minute. So this is the door, if you will, although it's upside down right now. So we can set the windscreens out like that. But if we put the lid down, you see this folds out of the lid. If we lift up on this, see how that unfolds? I hope you can see. The tabs go in. And there's our stove, which opens on the end here. So I don't want to do the inside. We do need to do the inside of the windscreens because that's what it's exposed when the oven isn't put together. But for right now, we're just going to do the outside of the oven because there's no point really doing the inside. It's not visible anyways. And I expect if it's going to burn off, that's going to be where it's going to burn up. You can see the top of this is quite rough. These stoves, or these oven parts, take a lot of abuse. And then they get exposed to damp and so there's the top. I'm not sure you can really see what's going on there, but it's definitely getting a shine to it. About the inside there. Now for the outside. It's difficult to know exactly what the best way to tackle these things is. So, try. I think this works. Yeah, it works. Everything on the Model 2. So let's set this aside and we'll get to work on the 9. Right, here's our Model 9. Now I learned on doing the Model 2. Let's start at the bottom. I don't have to do the legs on this. In fact, I could have taken these off. Whoever had this before me drilled out the rivets and put in these Chicago screws. You can see, I'm glad I wiped it down with methyl hydrate because that's just from doing the 2E and the 9 tank, and my rag is already black. seeing that the oil doesn't intake on there. So that's the first coat. You can see it's nice and shiny. My experience with drying oils like linseed oil and tung oil is what you see is what you get when it's dry. So I hope it's still shiny like this. We may have to look at some issues with the wings on the 9 where it's not sticking. I don't know what's up with that, but we'll see what happens when it dries. I'll check it tomorrow, but I expect it's going to be at least 48 hours. So I will see you when we check back.
48 hours later.
So it is approximately 46 hours later. I think the results speak for themselves pretty well. The matte finish is now sort of a semi-gloss. It's not as glossy as a clear coat, but I think it looks a lot better. In the meantime, I have done the stenciling on the 2D tank. As you can see, I've got the oven rack in place, which helps hold everything together better and make it more stable. I drilled out the screws in the bottom of the 2D for the burner assembly and retapped those, so I've now got some nice period correct 1024 flathead countersunk machine screws in there. Both generators have been cleaned. I've cleaned up the fuel lines and all of that on these, so they're ready to go. But as far as the boiled linseed oil goes, I would say about an hour and a half after applying it. And again, I just did a thin coat, of course not this, but here, up here. I just did a thin coat, basically enough to make it look wet. And within an hour and a half, I could handle it without leaving fingerprints. Interestingly enough, it was still a little bit sticky. But it didn't leave much of a residue on my fingers, but I got them set aside so they were out of the way and could sit. I checked back about 22 hours later, and I would say it was pretty much dry. It wasn't sticky anymore. It had a little, and it still does have a little bit of, I don't know what to call it other than a drag to it, but it's not sticky, it's not oily. I let it sit for an additional 24 hours just to see what would happen, and it hasn't really changed much. Now here's what I found. What I'm probably most interested in for future projects is how it does on this original paint. And it's not as glossy as it was when I first put it on. I don't know if it absorbed, if the metal and paint absorbed some of it or what the deal is. I'm thinking at some point I may try a second coat on that just to see what happens. I think it could probably do with that. But with a single coat, it does look better than it did to start with, and I think it is better protected. The Model 2D was painted with a high temperature black matte spray paint. It has a almost like primer on the inside. I'm assuming a high temperature primer. I know it's got to be high temperature because I fired this up and got it up to over 500, well over 500 degrees, and it wasn't smoking or burning off or anything. So this paint took the linseed oil extremely well. It sort of soaked it in, and it's got a nice sort of a semi-gloss or satin finish to it. The 9, however, the bottom half of it and the back side of the lid seem to be the same paint, but this almost had like 3 different types of paint on it. The paint inside the bottom part was different, and it took the linseed oil differently. It dried more quickly on that, and it just applied differently. The same goes for the inside of the lid, and then these wings. I'm not sure if I may try to add more or try to remove it. I think it's better than it was. But these wings, and you probably saw it in the video as I was applying it, the oil didn't soak in. It tended to sort of bead up. And oddly enough, it took back here, and then this outer part, it didn't. I'm not sure what that is, but it was definitely a different kind of paint on the wings and on the inside of the lid, and yet another different kind of paint inside the case. The outside seemed to be the same as what's on the 2D. So the linseed oil is going to react differently with the different finishes. I mean, it even reacted differently with the original paint and the metal. That, I don't know if it's just because it soaked it up or what, but I think that could actually use 2 coats if you wanted to. But the big thing I was worried about was that this wouldn't dry, or it would take weeks to dry. Talked to someone who, after 8 or 9 days, was having to come out and wipe things down to get the excess off. So I am pleased to say that did not happen. I just wiped it down with a very thin coat that was sufficient for everything, and it has dried and it looks good. So there you have it. So as an extra bonus on this, I am going to take the Model 2 outside, set it up, we're going to fire it up, and I am going to cook some cinnamon rolls. Let's fire this thing up. All right, we've got our hot blast going. Let's get this over to the burner. Light the auxiliary. And we'll close the lid. Now these won't be fancy biscuits or anything, they're just out of a tube. That's all I had time for today. They need to be baked for about 25 minutes at 350 degrees. So we'll let this get up to temperature, and I will use an infrared thermometer to check that when we get there. But these are surprisingly easy to regulate. So I'll see you when we get up to temperature. It's taken about 3.5 to 4 minutes. Some of it is just getting the heat adjusted so that the heat inside holds steady. But I am up to, depending on where I hit the inside, I'm between 340 and 370. So that's right where I want to be. So just open the door. Close it up, and I'll see you in about 20 to 25 minutes. All right, it's been 25 minutes. Go ahead and check this off. Close up. And there we've got cinnamon rolls. All that's left to make these really delicious. It's just a scoop. I think this is what makes these worth it. The biscuit, or the roll part, isn't anything great, but the Cinnabon frosting is delicious. So there you have it. Model 2D, boiled linseed oil, and the Model 9 as well. I think they turned out great. It's certainly working well. So see you next time.